In yesterday's episode, we saw how both endings to the Pitt DLC play out, siding with Lord Asher and siding with Werner. Now that we know what happens, we have to talk about the morality of this DLC. Which decision is the right decision? The answer is that there is no right decision. Both outcomes of this DLC are horrible. This lack of a good option at first frustrated me, because I can think of a plethora of different endings to this Pitt DLC where we can make a much more moral choice. For example, many of the slaves don't even care about the cure. They just want to leave. They're killed by raiders just trying to leave. What if instead of going with Werner to get the cure, we simply help the slaves rebel and leave the city? We don't have to kidnap a baby, and we don't murder and enslave people. We could blow a hole in the fence and evacuate the slaves under cover of dark. Or, what if we take a vial of blood from baby Marie and bring it back to, Dr. Lee in Rivet City? She's far better equipped than Sandra to create a cure for these poor people. She has an entire laboratory and team with her. Of course, it would be a matter of convincing her to work on it instead of working on the water situation. Or what about the lone wanderer, him or herself? We have the opportunity to spec high into science. What if we were scientific enough to be able to develop a cure ourselves? In which case we wouldn't need Asher or Werner or Dr. Lee at all. We could get a vial of the child's blood, create a cure with our science skill, and cure both the raiders and the slaves. I can think of plenty of ways to resolve this DLC that are far, far, far less evil. But Bethesda gave us only two choices, and both are evil. As I said, at first I was upset about this, but the more I think about it, the less upset I get, because in real life, we often find ourselves in situations where there are no good options. Whether at work, or in family life, or in politics, or war. All of the options we find before us are bad, and yet we still have to make a choice. I think this choice we get at the end of the Pitt DLC feels a little artificial, but the idea of being forced to make one of two horrible choices is very human, and it's realistic. Putting hypothetical situations aside, let's talk about the two realities we have: siding with Werner or siding with Asher. And before we can break these down, we really need to understand these two great personalities. Let's start with Werner. Werner is an evil man. He's an opportunist, and he's a liar. When we first meet him in the Capital Wasteland, he lies to us by not telling us the whole truth. He does not tell us that he used to be a raider. He does not tell us that he used to be Lord Asher's second in command. He does not tell us that the cure is really a child and that we would have to kidnap it. All he tells us is enough to engage our sympathies, that there are slaves that need to be freed. He lied to us. He manipulated us. Now, one could argue that such lies and manipulation are for the greater good. After all, he's trying to free the slaves. What greater good is there than that? But I would argue that Werner does not have such magnanimous motivations. I believe that Werner clearly betrays the fact that he is no better than any other raider in the game. In fact, he may be worse. We learn from Lord Asher that Werner used to be his second in command.
Werner used to be my second in command. Until he betrayed me.
But for how long? We don't know. It could have been months, it could have been years, it could have been a decade or more. How long was Werner perfectly content to enslave those poor people, to force them into hard labor, and to murder them for rebelling, before he finally changed his mind? How many slaves did he whip? How many of them did he murder? When we first meet him, and when we tell him we want to rescue the slaves in the Capital Wasteland, he shows a shocking amount of antipathy towards the idea for a man whose goal is to try and free the slaves.
Whatever, just get the outfit off of one of them while you're playing hero.
He only became a slave himself after attempting a failed coup.
He escaped after a failed coup, and I believe he's working with the slaves to plan a revolt.
He wanted power. He wanted Lord Asher's power. He tried to kill Lord Asher and become Raider King himself, but he failed. It was after this failure that Lord Asher banished him, sent him to the slave pens, instead of simply killing him, which I think was probably Lord Asher's greatest mistake. It was only after joining the slaves that Werner suddenly and inexplicably wanted to save the slaves. But this was all part of his strategy for achieving his initial goal, becoming Lord of the Pit. What the slaves lacked in ammunition and weaponry, they had in flesh. They had bodies. They had bodies and motivation. Werner manipulated the slaves. He manipulated Medea. As Asher's second-in-command, he had access to privileged information. He knew that Lord Asher had fathered a baby that was immune to radiation, who was immune to TDC. He knew that Lord Asher and Sandra were working on a cure in secret. He used this information and spread it around the slaves. Lord Asher has a cure. It's a secret cure. He's keeping it from you. He doesn't want to share it with you. We need to get this cure for ourselves. We need to rebel. This rebellion that he fostered in the slaves was not for their benefit. The fact that the slaves might benefit was incidental. The reason Werner wanted the rebellion was so that he could defeat Asher, was so that he could become Lord. We heard from Medea that the baby wasn't even her idea. The baby was Werner's idea. Werner came to them talking about the cure and the baby. The slaves and Medea, they just wanted to be free.
It's not like we were going to harm her. We just needed to kidnap her for our freedom. Okay. Werner was the one who wanted to steal the baby. I just wanted our freedom. I didn't think about what it would take. Just stop looking at me like that.
It was only after being manipulated by Werner that they wanted to get the baby, that they wanted to find the cure. If we side with Werner and the slaves, and if we defeat Lord Asher, for all practical purposes, Werner becomes overlord of the Pit. If we insist that he calls us boss, he does so, sure. But Werner orders the slaves, Werner drinks the booze, Werner slacks off, and Werner commands the Pit. The Lone Wanderer is overboss in name only. Werner is a despicable human being, and he's no better than a raider. He's clearly evil. But what about Lord Asher? Lord Asher is a little bit more complicated, and yet I believe that he is also clearly evil, and driven by many of the same motives as Werner. His own self-interest, his own power, his own glory. I want to be clear, though, that I think Asher is better than Werner in one regard. Asher is a genuine man, and Asher really does want to improve the Pit. The problem with Asher is, like Werner, he is willing to do anything, enslave, murder, and yes, even lie to achieve his ambition. While Werner's ambition is to become overlord so that he can have his way, Asher's ambition is to improve the city of Pittsburgh to create a legacy for himself and a legacy for his family. Asher's self-interest does include the interest of his wife and child, but it's ultimately still self-interest. He's a liar because, like Werner, he manipulates the slaves and the raiders. We spent part of an episode listening to his radio broadcasts, where many of you rightly commented that it sounded a lot like historic propaganda from an autocratic authoritarian ruler defending his forced labor as necessary for the rapid industrialization which would support the collectivization of the resources needed to rebuild his city. In fact, some of the exact phrases that Lord Asher used in his speeches, like "work will set you free," were used in historic forced labor camps from our own timeline. Bethesda clearly borrowed from historical examples of slavery, forced labor, and oppression when creating the personality of Lord Asher. Ishmael Asher thinks a lot of himself. He almost sees himself as a god. This is most clearly seen in his private holotapes to his daughter Marie.
The scavengers saw me as a god, so along with my Brotherhood know-how, it was easy to set up the basics. We started to build a city.
The scavengers saw me as a god, and so he began to act like a god. The other raiders pick up on this and even mock him for it. One of the first things we hear when we meet Crenshaw in Lord Asher's office is Crenshaw mocking his divine powers.
I'll be with you right after I maintain some order and dispense a little justice.
And I suppose you'll follow that up by raising the dead.
No, but I may heal the infirm later in the week. Time permitting, of course.
After 30 years of acting like a god, I think he's become deluded, and this delusion is obvious in his public speeches. He thinks that as long as it comes out of his mouth, the slaves will obey it. He genuinely thinks by calling them workers instead of slaves, he's improving morale, when of course the exact opposite is true. Slaves recognize his radio broadcasts and his large marketplace speeches as the propaganda that they are. When he stands in front of the marketplace and says bold-faced lies like the Pit has become the envy of the Commonwealth, the Capital Wasteland, and Ronto, it reminds me of tiny totalitarian regimes stuck half a century in the past, where most people don't even have electricity or running water, and yet the tyrants in charge still tell their people that they are the greatest powers on the planet, that all of their neighbors are really just envious of their power and success. When in reality, the Capital Wasteland, the Commonwealth, and Ronto probably don't even know that the Pit exists, and if they do, they've probably heard horrible things and try to steer clear of it. This kind of propaganda and manipulation has existed in the past, it exists in the real world today, and in the Fallout universe, it exists in Lord Asher's Pit. Lord Asher is a liar. My biggest problem with Lord Asher, however, is his obsession with Pittsburgh. We learned from his holotapes that he was a former Brotherhood of Steel soldier, possibly a scribe. He described himself as a scholar. He criticizes the Brotherhood of Steel, calling them all lazy because they simply swept through Pittsburgh, destroyed all of the trogs and cannibals living there, and moved on. He criticized them because they didn't try to rebuild the city. Lord Asher, however, is willing to put in that hard work. He sees himself as morally better than the Brotherhood. He's willing to work hard. He wants to rebuild the city. He wants to make it a better place for people. And to achieve that goal, he's willing to do anything. He excuses every evil atrocity that he and his raiders do by saying that it's in the best interests of the city. He's just trying to rebuild. He's just trying to cure TDC. Yes, I'm kidnapping. Yes, I'm murdering, but it's all for the sake of the city. You see, I'm really the good guy. I'm really trying to rebuild. Everyone else is just lazy. No one else has the constitution to make the tough decisions. But my problem is, why make the city to begin with? Why is rebuilding the city a worthy goal at all? It seems insane to me. No one's trying to build a sprawling city of industry in the middle of the glowing sea. No one's trying to build a sprawling city at the Sierra Madre. No one is trying to build a center of industry at the bottom of the sea because these places are inhospitable to human life. Of course no one's going to rebuild there. People die there, unless they have unique genetic mutations that make them immune to the negative effects of those areas. The children of Atom inhabit the crater of Atom not because they like getting sick, but because they're immune to the radiation sickness that most people suffer. And how insane would it be for them to kidnap people from downtown Boston, drag them to the glowing sea to perform hard labor and say, yeah, it sucks that you guys are getting sick and are likely gonna die, but we need you here to support us while we come up with a cure to radiation poisoning. The construction workers at the Sierra Madre turned into mindless, violent ghost people. They mutated into these creatures that were both alive and dead, stuck in their radiation suits, and animated only by a primal desire to kill. The only ones who can survive for extended periods of time in that environment are ghouls like Dean. Everyone else dies really quickly. So why would we create a city in these places? The sanest solution is to not create cities in places that can kill you. Why is Asher trying to build a city in the Pit? Sure, he says that it's because it has a working steel mill, but he only uses that steel mill to make weapons and ammunition to give to raiders to go out into the wastes to kill and rob people or kidnap them and bring them back to the city. He could make his city in a different place that sure didn't have a steel mill, but it also doesn't have TDC, so nobody's gonna die, and it can grow naturally, meaning that he doesn't have to go out and kidnap people, therefore he doesn't need a steel mill. The Pit is possibly one of the most toxic places we can visit in the Fallout universe. It sits at the confluence of 3 different rivers that constantly feed the city with radiation and toxins that wash in from the continent. On top of that, centuries of industry before the bombs dropped have created layer upon layer of toxic chemicals that are unique to the Pit. And as Lord Asher brings in more people to work the steel mill, all he's doing is creating even more toxins. In my mind, it's crazy for Lord Asher to think that it's even a noble goal to rebuild Pittsburgh. A survivor does not build his home in hazardous places. A wise man builds on rock, not sand. If he were alone in this crazy scheme of his, if he really loved Pittsburgh so much that he didn't care about the personal cost, so he personally moves in and personally chooses to live there and personally rebuilds the city, then that's fine. He can do whatever he wants with his life. It's his life. But the moment his passion and his desire for Pittsburgh causes him to forcibly take people and bring them to this spot, to enslave them to achieve something that's important only to him, that's when he becomes an incredibly evil man. Sure, Pittsburgh may be important to him. Sure, rebuilding the city may be his personal ambition, but it's not Medea's ambition. It's not Kai's desire. It's not Aiden's great goal in life. Why should they sacrifice their entire lives to achieve Lord Asher's dream? Why are their lives worth less than his? Why are their desires worth less than his? Why is it an inferior desire for Aiden to go out and live a healthy life and marry and start a family, but a superior ambition for Asher to rebuild Pittsburgh? To make it even worse, Asher knows that slavery is wrong. Every time we try to talk with him about it, he gets sullen, he gets kind of apologetic, he gets sheepish, and he says, well, I really wish I didn't have to enslave people, but I have to, for the sake of the city. The city would crumble, if not for the slaves, because we cannot have children, so we have to go out and find people and bring them in, all for the sake of the city. But this logic is stupid. Of course, without the slaves, the city would fall apart. But so what? Let's look at American history. What if a slave owner, before the American Civil War, defended what he was doing by saying, well, yeah, slavery sucks, but without the slaves, cotton would be more expensive? Well, yeah, of course it would be more expensive, but that doesn't excuse the slavery. Sure, it's nice to have cheap cotton. Sure, it would be great to see industry again in Pittsburgh. But neither of those things excuse enslaving entire generations of people. And this is the danger with the whole ends justifies the means argument. If we admit that there are some ends that are so good and so beneficial to humanity that they excuse atrocities, especially atrocities like genocide and slavery, then we have to ask, who's the one who places a value on the ends to begin with? That is, who's the one who decides that the end result is really worth the cost? Well, typically it's going to be the tyrant in power, and that tyrant in power is going to be biased by his own ambitions, by his own wealth, by clinging to his own power. This makes him an unsuitable judge about the ends, which gives him no moral right to make a decision about the means. But then we have to deal with the needs of the many outweighing the needs of the few. We have a similar problem with that philosophy. Because after all is said and done, even if we don't think Pittsburgh is really worth it, we can still sit here and say that enslaving all of these people is still worth it because Asher and Sandra are going to find a cure to TDC. The cure to TDC could help hundreds of thousands of people, potentially millions in the future. Therefore, enslaving a few hundred people now is a small price to pay because the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. Now we have the same problem with this philosophy as we do with the last one, because who is it who decides what the needs of the many are? And how do we differentiate between the needs of the many and the wants of the many? But beneath all of this, there's a fundamental problem with the cure itself. There are two women in this DLC who have the potential to find a cure. Sandra, Marie's mother, and Medea, an old slave. If we choose Asher's ending, Marie stays with her mother. If we choose Werner's ending, she stays with Medea. Medea tells us that she's working on the cure, but looking after this child is so time-intensive that she has practically no time left to work on the cure. Plus, Medea has absolutely no scientific training whatsoever. How can we possibly believe that the slaves would ever create a cure from Marie? That, I think, is the most difficult pill to swallow. If we really want to produce a cure, I think the clear choice is to leave the child with Sandra. Sandra is the only person, aside from possibly Lord Asher, who has any scientific background. She is the only person who could possibly produce a cure from little Marie. If we choose to kill Sandra and Asher and we give their baby to Medea, I believe that this is a death sentence for the cure. I don't think Werner knows what he's doing. I don't think Medea knows what she's doing. But the cure becomes irrelevant if there's no one left to cure. This goes back to my initial problem with forcing people to stay in Pittsburgh to begin with. If everyone is free to leave Pittsburgh, then nobody's gonna get sick. If there's no one sick from TDC, then there's no need for a cure. Now, some may say that not everyone was kidnapped and dragged to Pittsburgh. There were some people who were born here. Pittsburgh is their home. How can we force people to leave their home? Shouldn't we instead make their home a more hospitable place? Well, no. Instead, I think the more moral option is to give people the freedom to either leave or stay. If I build my house next to a volcano, it erupts and lava comes in and burns my house down. Do I move, or do I force my neighbors to tear down their homes and use the wood to build me a new one in the same spot? And when it burns down, to go find their neighbors and tear down their homes to rebuild mine in the same spot? In the end, I think we're all responsible for our own survival. If we find ourselves in an inhospitable place, it's our responsibility either to find a way to survive there or to leave and find a more hospitable place. It's not moral in any way to take people away from their homes to make our lives a little bit more comfortable, or to help us find a way to live in our own disaster. But all of this may be a completely moot point, because we have no evidence that a cure is even possible. How do we know that Sandra can even produce a cure? How do we know that little Marie even has a cure in her body? Because they say so? Because they think it's possible? Here's what we know. Marie is the first child to be born in the pit in God knows how many generations. She didn't go trog, she didn't die, but she's still an infant. Her parents think that she has this cure in her blood, that she was born with an immunity to radiation and TDC, but we have clear evidence of other children who survived well into their late childhood in the pit. When we talk with Paladin Kodiak back at the Citadel, he tells us that he and 20 other children were alive and well and free of mutations when the Brotherhood swept in during the Scourge. They were so free of mutations, despite the fact that they spent their entire childhoods in the pit, that the Brotherhood took them and raised them. This tells us that maybe Marie is not unique. Maybe her immunity is not rare. Maybe people just respond to the radiation and TDC in different ways. But assuming for the moment that Marie really does have the cure in her body, how do we know that this is gonna last? She's still an infant. She can't walk, she can't talk. How do we know that when she becomes a toddler, she's not suddenly gonna succumb to TDC? Or what about when she hits puberty? Crazy things happen in a body when a person hits puberty. How do we know that she's still going to be immune at that time? Maybe this immunity in her blood only works on infants. How do we know that taking it out of her body, we can produce something that'll even work for adults who have been exposed to TDC for decades? And how do we know that Sandra can even achieve her goal of developing a cure for Marie's blood? Is that even scientifically possible? I don't know. The slaves don't know. The raiders don't know. Sandra doesn't know. This cure is a pipe dream. This cure is untested. This cure is unknowable until they produce it. And Lord Asher wants to enslave an entire population for possibly even 10 years while they wait for a cure that is not guaranteed to arrive. It's that reality that pushed me over to siding with the slaves. I think kidnapping that baby is evil, don't get me wrong. It is evil to kidnap that child. And yes, by killing Marie's mother, by killing Sandra, we're dooming the population of Pittsburgh. There's no way these slaves could produce a cure. But since we have no guarantee that a cure is even possible, I just can't justify enslaving hundreds of people while we wait for a miracle. Let's pretend the baby doesn't even exist. Let's pretend the cure isn't even there. I think that would make this decision much easier for most people. Sure, enslaving all of these people allows Asher to rebuild a city, but it's still not worth it. This slavery is still an atrocity. Plus, Lord Asher has had 30 years to rebuild the city. The Scourge came by 30 years ago, and after 30 years, the place is still a mess. All he has done is restart these steel mills to produce ammunition and weapons that he gives to the raiders so that they can raid caravans and cities. We must remember it's not just the people in the pit who suffer. It's people all over the place, in Ronto, in the Capital Wasteland, and in the Commonwealth. Wherever these raiders can hit, wherever they can kidnap people, wherever they can buy slaves, they all suffer because of the pit. One could argue that Asher hasn't had success in rebuilding the pit, in creating some new great society because of all of the poisons that exist in the pit. No one wants to live there because it's so toxic, which is why he has to go kidnap people and drag them to the pit and forcibly enslave them to do his work. And I think that's because most people are smart when it comes to their own survival. They don't want to live in a toxic place. Who would want to choose to live there in Pittsburgh? No one, which is why he has to kidnap people and drag them there. This whole city we find there is completely inorganic. It wouldn't exist in the natural order of things because Asher has propped it up with slavery. We do have to think about the alternatives. What is the alternative to a city that enslaves people? Well, the alternative is the horror that existed in the pit before the Scourge, and we don't really know how horrible this was. Paladin Kodiak talked about gang rapes, cannibalism, murder. It was nasty stuff. Not even Medea remembers what happened at that time, and she's one of the oldest people there, but even she suggests that things may be better with Lord Asher. Maybe a city of raiders and slaves is better than what would naturally occur here. And that's definitely a legitimate argument. But I'm still going to reject it because I think that it's better to give people the freedom to choose. If the slaves are free, every single one of them can choose to either stay or leave. If the raiders and slaves choose to stay, that's their choice. If they really buy into Asher's ambition of rebuilding Pittsburgh, more power to them. Let them work the steel mills themselves. Let them take turns going out and looking for food. Let every man and woman choose to rebuild Pittsburgh instead of being forced to rebuild Pittsburgh. Now, some may not be able to get past the idea that we're kidnapping a child, an infant, to free the slaves. And that's why at the very beginning I said that there is no good option here. Yeah, I mean, kidnapping the baby is evil. There's just no getting around it. You're killing the kid's family. You're making that child an orphan. You're putting a child in the hands of new people who won't raise that child as well as her parents would have. And that's doggone evil. We can think about it like warfare. If the slaves go to war to defend themselves, naturally they have to defeat their enemies. If those enemies happen to be parents, the slaves can't stop their war just because they may make some children orphans. Becoming a parent doesn't make you morally right in any battle you partake in, just because if you die, your child might become an orphan. These slaves still have to fight for their freedom, and as a consequence, still have to kill Asher and Sandra. But they're stuck with baby Marie, and what do they choose? To kill the baby, or to take the child into foster care? It's a horrible situation for the child, but it's better to care for Marie than to kill her. Incidentally, this is something that the raiders never think about. How many children have been made orphans by Asher and his raiders? Some may try to defend Asher by saying, well, it's really just the raiders who are doing the enslaving. It's the raiders who are doing the killing, but the raiders wouldn't be doing any of that unless they were ordered to and allowed to do by Asher. This is all part of Asher's strategy. He's propping up his city with slave labor. He is sending his raiders out to kidnap people. And when he kidnaps parents and brings them back to the pit, he leaves children orphans. How many of those children have died to starvation or disease because their parents are gone? How many of those children did the raiders simply kill? How many children have raiders killed when they sack caravans with traveling families? If we say that we really care about children, how can we support raiders who kill children on every raid outside of the pit? The difference, of course, is that we have to watch baby Marie get kidnapped. We have to kidnap her ourselves. We have to hand her over to strangers that are not her parents. But just because we don't see raiders kill children outside of the pit doesn't mean they don't. Instead of making my decision by saying, the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few, instead of making my decision by saying, the ends justify the means, I'm making my decision by asking the question, which option grants the most people their own personal liberty? I believe that option is to side with Werner. And so that was the choice I made. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a tough one, and I'd love to hear your thoughts. How did you resolve this tragic and delicate conundrum? Do you agree that both Werner and Asher are evil? Do you agree that it's likely impossible that the slaves could ever produce a cure? How did you go about making the decision in your game? Let me know your thoughts in the comments section below. We're almost done with the pit. We have one video to go. In tomorrow's episode, we're going to go over every unique new piece of gear and loot that we can get from the pit. So if you want to make sure that you didn't miss something awesome, be sure to subscribe and to click that bell notification button so that you don't miss tomorrow's video. Thanks for watching, everybody. If you like what I do and you want to support me in a more personal way, consider becoming one of my patrons on Patreon. But more than anything, I'm just so glad you're watching this video with me today. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you tomorrow morning, bright and early, with a brand new video.